In light of the current pandemic, sir, what as per you will the ramifications be on the legal proceedings, on students graduating this year, and also on the corporate culture?
That's again a very, very important question. Something that I'm grappling with, something that we are all grappling with.
Yeah.
I can't claim to have an answer, but I can share some of my thoughts. I mean, there is always a silver lining to the whole thing, depending on if you see the glass is half full or half empty. I see it as half full in the sense that it has made us capable of working remotely. We all have upped our technological infrastructures. The courts are doing VC, the law firms are doing it. We are becoming so much more efficient in how we do things. So that's clearly an upside. How far we'd be able to do it is also a question. Whether we can extend it, just to take an example, to the trial courts, the VC hearings, that is still a long way off for us to be able to effectively argue all our cases, urgent or non-urgent, through a computer. Completely digitizing everything is still some way off. We've all sort of, failed in our duty over the years to be prepared for it better. I think, this was the writing on the wall. If you look at Bill Gates speaking, sometime in 2015, that this is
Yes,
going to
Mr.
happen. This
Talk.
is the writing on the wall, and we are not preparing ourselves, whether in terms
Definitely.
of health capacity or in terms of preparedness. So we haven't done much, but yes, sometimes you learn the hard way, and I think we are. So as far as the courts and the lawyers are concerned, we are learning to grapple. Justice is as essential as many of the other things, and we should get it back on soon but it's important for us to learn lessons and not just when things get better to just forget all about this and come back to the conventional ways. We need to guard against that. Young law students or people who are graduating this year, there is a certain amount of anxiety which is not unfounded on what the options are. Most lawyers and law firms have kept up, with their commitment in terms of hirings and their commitment in terms of giving opportunities, whether internships or not, virtual or otherwise, in order to just, keep the show running and to, also do enough for the resources. In many firms, people who are deriving equity or, bonuses have at the relatively higher echelons have agreed not to receive them, and then so as to ensure that the younger associates and the interns and the associates who are going to be hired in future do get their due or do get their opportunities, which is commendable. That's what's expected, in a time of crisis where we sort of take a step back and think beyond our own interests. And many lawyers, and most lawyers I know, have demonstrated that, and I think they're going to come up with it, or keep up with it and provide those opportunities promised, or otherwise create opportunities. That what I love about the legal sector is the resilience that it has to any problem, to any calamity like this. For example, 1 or 2, 3 years back, when the IBC came in, the M&A sector, for example, was not doing as well. People thought the economy has taken a downturn. It's not doing so well. People are not investing in the country.
Right.
Businesses are failing. The NPAs are huge. The economy is in doldrums. What would lawyers do, right? So,
Right.
but in between all that NPA crisis, the IBC came in and created such a huge practice area for lawyers. And you wouldn't believe, in those 1 or 2 years, the annual revenues for firms and for lawyers actually increased rather than decreasing, despite the recession and the depressed financial state. IBC created so many opportunities for lawyers dealing with stressed assets, IRPs, CAs, valuers, lawyers, doing IBC practice, and became a big revenue churner, and biggest revenue churner in those years, in fact. So the point that I'm trying to make is that out of this, apparent difficulty, also a lot of opportunities would come up for lawyers, and they already are. Lawyers and law firms uh, continue to advise a lot of clients on contractual matters, on force majeure, on license lease, what is the impact of COVID on contractual assignments.
True.
So there would be litigation, as long as human beings, continue to be on this planet. There would be work for
Absolutely.
lawyers, and it's just that it's a different kind of work, and it would be slightly different from what you're used to doing. So there, your ability to adapt where your ability to go outside your comfort zone and read about a new practice area and make sure you have a solution for a client becomes extremely important. So your flexibility and adaptability would ensure that you stay afloat. So for young lawyers, very important for you to read up all there is to COVID and the legal system, whichever legal stream it is, for you to be prepared, because these are the skills that we would need tomorrow in order to advise our clients effectively.
Very well said, sir. Moving on to the next question, which is also related. I want to ask you that. Do you think ADR mechanism in these times will emerge as a savior in tackling the backlogs of cases when post COVID-19?
Absolutely. It's a leaner way of doing it. It's a more efficient way of doing it. It does not run into the problems that a centralized system, a bureaucratic system like regular suits would. It gives parties flexibilities to get things. Most of the arbitrations at the international commercial level that we do, most of the things are done on email and in an e-form. The filings are in e-form. The discovery is in an e-form where you put all your documents in one software and the opposite side can go through those documents. And we never get to see the opposite party till many months down the dispute and when the actual hearing takes place. And all of which it is done is, I was doing a big multi-million dollar arbitration recently with LCIA, where we did the arbitration, completed the arbitration effectively in 1 year. And we physically met with the opposite party and the arbitrators only for 5 days. Rest of the year, we are all working through discovery softwares and e-filings, and that was so efficient and could decide a very, very complex commercial shareholders dispute without ever physically meeting. And this would, in any event, all the major contracts do have arbitration clauses and people are turning away from traditional civil processes. I think this would get further augmented by this because our systems are not ready, and ADR is a much more effective way of doing things. And not just arbitration, mediation, pre-litigation mediation. More and more people feel encouraged to re-examine their contracts instead of just running to the court. For example, if there is a case where you are not able to provide goods and services under a contract to somebody, and there is a question of whether where the liability lies, whether the contract is frustrated or not. More and more people are actually engaging in active mediation in order to resolve it before going to litigation. Of course, people do understand that their litigation also is a problem in times like these. Where do you go? How do you convince the court as to the urgency? And maybe that is what is making them mediate more actively. But I would like to believe that people are exploring pre-litigation mediation more actively in these times to find out just and reasonable solutions for solving a problem rather than to be just trigger happy and to initiate litigation, which may not be very, very efficient. So yeah, great opportunities for ADR, specialists in times such as these.
Okay. So while you're agreeing that there's a lot of digitalization of courts in the present time, while this technique was already introduced in the field of arbitration a very long time ago. So my question to you is, how can we overcome the gaps created by virtual hearing in the e-arbitration process on cross-examination, or how different is it from the traditional setup? Also, following that question, how will it impact on the evaluation of factors such as body language, emotional sense of witness or of the accused who are being cross-examined virtually?
Sure, that's a great question again. I'm not a huge fan personally of cross examinations and evidence on video conferencing, and you're absolutely right that if you're just looking at somebody on a screen, you don't really know how the person is responding. You're not in the same room as that person. Demeanor is a very important element of appreciation of evidence. You can make an assessment of whether the witness is believable or not, whether the witness has sweaty palms, whether he's doing something with his fingers, is he tapping his foot, is he looking at his counsel after every question, is he trying to look at his phone, does he have a screen up there? We don't know any of that when the witness is sitting in some other part of the world. The other problem with this is maybe the witness is sitting in a jurisdiction where the witness is not subject to the laws of perjury, for example. When we started off in India on jurisprudence of video conferencing, the courts made it very, very clear that even in cases where we would allow in a suit for testimony to be done through video conferencing, the witness should be in a state or a country which has a treaty with us, where perjury is punishable, and where we would be able to get this guy if he makes a false statement on oath.
Hmm.
All of that is a huge problem. If you're sitting somewhere else in the world, you know that you can possibly get away with impunity after making a false statement. It would increase perjury. It would there wouldn't be a great incentive on people to say the truth anymore. Further, if people are in the same room, there's one more benefit. If both the parties are there, more often than not, in your lunch break, in your coffee breaks, people sort of reach out to each other, and arbitrators also encourage it, and many cases are solved, you know, by those discussions, by just being there in each other's presence. It's a more personal way of doing this. Many cases have gone into very, very tough legal battles, but they've ended up being settled just because, two business partners saw each other in person and shook hands. And with slight nudging from the lawyers and the arbitrators, they said, "Why don't you go have coffee? We'll discuss the procedural aspects in the meanwhile." And they go out and they come back in and say that we have a solution. Let's not indulge in this wasteful litigation exercise. Let's solve it amicably. And these have happened. So that also is something that hearing sort of takes away from. But then again, if there is something that's the need of the hour, it has to be done. But it's certainly not ideal. I'm sure we can think of ways to, look at demeanor better, have better cameras, better views, more oversight in terms of who's there at the other end from where the witness is deposing. We can get into those nitty gritties and try to make it better. But I am personally not a huge fan.
Okay. Thank you, Bharat, for answering this. Bharat, my next question is related to data privacy, as you also handle data privacy. So, uh, recently, various data protection authorities such as France CNIL and Danish DPA has issued guidances for prohibiting employers to record temperature of their employees. But uh, in India, not having a specific data privacy legislation and specifically not having a regulatory authority is impacting data privacy rights, and also data controllers are misusing the information of data subjects. So what is your take on it? That is it impacting us badly at this pandemic time?
It is certainly the importance of having a data protection regime cannot be emphasized enough. We've been arguing this for the longest time. Um this is problematic, and not just this. There are other issues on privacy and how inroads are made sometimes in the moments of national crisis in privacy rights. And privacy is sort of seen as a lesser right, which can always be sacrificed at the altar of national emergency. It's always
True.
seen like that. And if you look at the US scenario after 9/11, a lot of excesses were done in the name of national security, in the name of the interests of the nation and other things. So one should always be on the guard for such tendencies in the times of pandemic. We need the law, but and we've needed the law for the longest time. The Supreme Court's argued about it. Committees have sat on it. We've moved back and forth on it, uh, but it remains
So do you
contentious.
think employers have right to record temperature of their employees?
I think it's not as I mean, if in a contractual setup, I'm sure there is an implied consent of everyone walking into the office, and that's what, on a contractual level, for example, is how the employers would defend something like that. This is the balancing of rights. For example, the right of everyone to be healthy and to be secure in a workplace versus somebody's right not to
But
give a
health data
temperature. I would
cannot
say
be revealed. As per
sure.
GDPR also, health
That's
data
correct.
cannot be revealed.
Sure. So you are here trying to do a balance. Of course, data protection also would have a lot of exceptions, right? It's not an absolute right, or right to privacy is not absolute. If you are holding that temperature data, for example, for a particular limited finite period of time and only for a certain analysis, and not retaining it and not
Right.
storing it and not disseminating it further, then I think in a given case you've struck the right balance between the health of everyone else and the individual's right to privacy. So those accommodations have to be done in the time of crisis, but we definitely need the law.
Okay. Okay.
Very well
Yeah.
said, sir. Moving ahead to our next question. So, India has always embraced the principles of independence of all the three organs of the state. In light of the recent events, like the transfer of a judge from Delhi High Court to Chandigarh High Court, or be it the nomination of ex-CJI as a member of parliament, These all raises the questions on the independence of judiciary. Sir, do you think that such sort of will hamper the delivery of justice and reliance of people over judiciary?
That's important. Independence of judiciary is a part of the basic structure. Is one of the most important edifices on which the system stands. A judge who's always in the fear of reprisal from the executive if a unpopular or an order is passed against the executive can never really dispense actual justice. There's a reason that we had separation of powers, and in the structure that we have, there is a reason that we entrusted the judiciary with the capacity to review the actions of the executive and the legislature and to act as checks and balances. There was a reason for all of this historically and otherwise, and this served us well for a long time. Indian judiciary was seen as one of the best across the world as far as judicial review powers is concerned and its activism is concerned. And we did really well, especially in the 70s and the 80s, 80s and the 90s, in fact. So that's good. But in recent times, without getting into the specifics of any case, I think independence of the judiciary needs to be maintained and upheld. We had this huge discussion about independence of judiciary and executive interference even at the time of the discussion on how judges should be appointed in the first place and whether we should have a national judicial appointments commission or collegium is doing a fine job. All of this came up even then, and I think everyone agreed that independence of judiciary is paramount. And I understand there have to be checks and balances in terms of how judges are appointed and how they function, and nobody is above scrutiny. But that scrutiny should not lead to a situation where, as I love to say, that we judges, who are looking forward and not forward looking, in terms of their post retirement
I will
appointments
definitely
or
second your
benefits.
point, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So moving ahead to the next question. The social media platform is currently buzzing with opinion on Boys Locker Room, which is an Instagram chat room sharing objectionable views on girls and also their morphed pictures. So how do you see this as an act of abuse of freedom of speech and expression on social media platforms? Following that, what are the legal actions that can be taken to prohibit such activities from happening again in the future?
That's an important point. I think we have sufficient laws in terms of the IT Act, IPC, and otherwise to regulate such conduct, and I think the action is being taken. Freedom of speech, of course, is not an absolute right. Just as Holmes said very famously that you have a freedom of speech, but you do not have the freedom to say fire in a crowded theater, or you do not have the freedom to say something that incites violence or is defamatory or obscene in other ways and otherwise problematic. So definitely there are limits to freedom of speech, and I think these are sufficiently entrenched in the system in terms of various laws, and the necessary action would be taken. This is the only way, in a technological infrastructure to do it. There can't be a pre-censorship, because pre-censorship is again a slippery slope and is ends up becoming where the remedy is worse than the problem itself. You'll have to check speech as it comes up and then deal with it on a case to case basis and bring the offenders to book. There is no other way. If for example, what's the alternative? Do you get the intermediaries or the platforms to scan speech at their end and take it off? But that has the risk of you making those intermediaries super censors.
Yes,
Can X
breaching the
website decide?
privacy of the other side. Yes.
That's right. And then can a private entity, for example, an X website which runs a journal, can it decide what is just and fair or what is illegal to say on a public platform? I think at the end of the day, the court should decide or a regulator should decide, and not you and me, for example, because that would be too much of a compromise with freedom of speech again, and it is to be a free space. So pre-censorship is not the answer. Dealing with these things on a case-to-case basis is the answer. And yeah.
So can we do something to deter this so that it doesn't happen in future, like some legislative action you would like to suggest? or something on behalf of the power holders which can be done so that it doesn't
Hmm.
repeat in future?
I think for me, I'm always wary of the legislature coming in and trying to respond to a situation because it ends up becoming extremely knee-jerk. In India, we are fascinated with the idea of enacting new laws and enacting new sections without ever caring to implement them properly or bringing the offenders to book. Now the legislature can actually come up with a new law to say that this is how things are required to be done. But we don't need that. We have enough and many already. The idea is to take a case, investigate it well, bring the offenders to justice. Certainty of the punishment, as I love to say, is a bigger deterrent than the intensity of the punishment or the severity of the punishment. The person should know that if I do this, I'll be brought to trial and justice in a finite time period, and I would really have to face the music. And if a person understands that, that really leads to a lot of change on the ground as far as people are concerned. It can't be too top down in terms of a legislative interference each time. It has to be consistent application of law, good investigation, good decision making, and necessary convictions at the relevant point of time. That is a far bigger deterrent.
Definitely, sir. Thank you for answering that. Moving ahead with our next question, can you please throw some light on the art of reading judgments and bare acts? Also, how can one improve upon the art of judgment writing or legal drafting?
Sure, that's interesting. Art of reading a judgment is again something that I've done extensive work on. And why do I need to do work on the art of reading a judgment? Is because some of the judgments that we have out there, sorry to say, are extremely and utterly unreadable. Um, it seems that many of the times the judgment is an exercise in not deciding a dispute and getting a point across, but to show off the literary genius of somebody writing who wants to create a legacy in terms of what one has written. One need to get beyond that. The idea of a judgment is to decide a dispute, communicate why the judge decided the way that the judge decided. Uh, Justice should not only be done, it should be seen to be done. The reason should be clear. The factual narration should be clear. The losing party should know why the losing party has lost so that they can appeal. The judges have to remember that, that the judgment is being written for the litigant. Ignorance of law is no excuse, right? And the judgment is law. So if a litigant cannot understand the judgment, then it's a very unfair situation for the litigant to be in. He doesn't understand if particular conduct is prohibited or not. So we owe it to the litigants and to people at large who want to understand law to make our judgments more understandable. I've written extensively on how should you approach the art of writing a judgment, which may be of interest to the judicial aspirants listening in, and they may refer to the work that I've done there. Coming back to the art of reading a judgment, as I said, it's very difficult for even us to read judgments like 170 paragraphs. Out of that, 140 paragraphs would be history. For example, there's a
Exactly.
judgment written on, gender justice. Then the judge feels it incumbent on him to quote the Rig Ved or something written 3,000 years back on women. No, we don't need that. We don't need, the Upanishads to tell us that women should be respected.
You are
That has
speaking
no
my
part.
mind, Bharat. You're speaking my mind.
So there's
We do not.
sometimes songs and things like that
Yeah,
also quoted
yeah. So
along.
it then on the song side of it, it becomes a little frivolous. Then you cannot trivialize a serious question that you are deciding, and then it also becomes very very subjective. These are serious
Absolutely.
documents, but the problem is that they are burdened with the history, with the and I personally feel that some people have unrealized literary ambitions that they want to translate, wanting to create a
And so
legacy,
we have,
wanting to make it
Absolutely.
sorry to
comprehensive.
intrude, we have judgments as long as 700 to even beyond pages.
Yeah. And then that's and then there is no conscious attempt to make it understandable, give the key takeaways, or if there are separate opinions, try to put them together and look at the common denominator so that somebody understands what it is. People do not use visual aids and maps and pictures and good table of contents, in order to make them understandable. So a lot needs to be done. Uh, as far as writing a judgment is concerned, I would approach reading a judgment. Obviously, there is no, straight jacket formula to it. A judgment has to be read, in whole. But as you start reading judgments, you would realize that some paras can be skipped. for example, somebody is relating like, all these extra legal things, then you can skip those paras quickly. You need to arrive at what the ratio of the judgment is, right? That's the essence of reading a judgment. You would never read a judgment otherwise. And that ratio, it is important to understand, is the critical question that the judgment answers, which was not answered earlier. And that general proposition that the judgment carves out for future application is what the ratio is, and you need to come at that. And for that, you'll, as you go along and start reading judgment, you would develop the ability of sifting the chaff from the grain. You would know what is relevant and what is irrelevant, and you'd speed read. So developing the art of speed reading and skipping through unnecessary paras is important, but that is again something that has to be cultivated. I cannot give you a formula here. You would know circumstantially that this is something I need to read or work on or not. Obiter, again, you need to distinguish what the judgment stands for. I see a lot of fascination that I know a judgment on a point, but sometimes that judgment doesn't add anything to the discourse. The Bear Act says the same thing, and the judgment hasn't really taken it beyond.
Right.
Then you don't need that judgment. Whether it is in
Absolutely.
terms of writing for an exam or remembering it, you need to remember a judgment only when it does something incremental and evolves the law. So
Absolutely.
make sure the judgments that you read are the ones that really lay down some new proposition. Good legal writing is something that covers good judgment writing also. If you learn to write well, you will make a good briefing note. You would make a good draft of a pleading that you're doing, good application, and a good judgment that you write. The ground rules for me are that I would never write something on paper that I cannot say to a friend. So I always write and then I try to read it out aloud to see how it sounds. If I cannot read it out to a friend who's non-legal, by the way, then I won't write it in the judgment, because
Oh,
the idea is to communicate a point. And if it is
absolutely.
not understandable, then it is not understandable. I need to rewrite. And good judgments and good legal briefs are not written, they are rewritten. You have to keep revisiting them. There are drafts that I've revisited like 10 times in order before getting them out. And that also holds true for some of the articles that I've written. You need to write simply, you need to write short. I love to say less is more.
Absolutely.
It's not the quantity, it's the quality that matters. And if you can't write simply enough, you don't understand it well enough, please go back to how you have to do it. We've been doing a lot of work on the plain English movement, where we are trying
Okay.
to get rid of ornamentalization and grand phrases and a lot of Latin and French. We believe that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Let's be as straight as we can. uh, then when you're writing a judgment, for example, if you're writing the factual narration, it's always important not to just copy the pleadings and to try to write it in your own language after internalizing the facts. It ensures that you've read the facts really well and you can write them better in a lesser number of words. Then there is a rule that you have to write only those facts which are chronological, relevant, admissible, and material. That I
Okay.
call it the rule of cram, and this is the rule that possibly everyone should cram.
Rule
Uh,
of cram.
yeah,
Okay.
the facts have to be written chronologically, and
Okay.
in terms of relevancy, admissibility, and materiality.
That's the
This,
word of the day for me. Yeah.
thanks. This
I'm
is just one
awestruck
formulation that,
anyway.
So you were talking about the art of reading judgment, and I got the word of the day, rule of cram. So yeah.
Yeah. Also, when it's important for us to have these formulations. I also like, when I talk to younger judges on how to write a judgment, I tell them when you're writing facts, you follow the rule of WDWTW. Now, this is not as attractive a formulation as the other one. I'm sorry about
Okay.
that, but I couldn't come up with anything better. So what it stands for is that who did what to whom.
Okay. Who did
So the
what to
first
whom?
alphabet of each of the words there, who did what to whom. So
Oh,
that's the rule of writing facts. If
interesting.
your judgment doesn't say that in the first few paragraphs, then it doesn't catch me as a reader. Then it doesn't tell me that what you're going to decide. It tells you about who. And this is also, a rule. For example, in my team, whenever I'm being briefed by my younger colleagues, I keep telling them that there is a structure to a briefing. And this structure is common to when you're writing in a judgment, for example. That structure may be, you have to first tell me who is this case about. If you're writing a case comment, for example, or if you're deciding something, who is the first question. The
Okay.
second question is when, where, and how.
Okay.
You already told me who the actors are. One is a shareholder, the other is the management. Then you tell me when, where, and how. When did this happen? Where did this happen? And how did this happen?
Okay.
And the
Okay.
third point is, what do you want the court to do?
Okay.
And the fourth and the last question is, why should the court do it?
Okay.
So if you follow this formulation, you are able to brief a senior and give him all the necessary information that he needs. If you're using this formulation in in a judgment or in a pleading, then you're telling the judge that yes, these are the actors. On one side I have a partner, and the other side I have the other partner. Things have gone bad, and this is the case. Second is
Okay.
when, where, and how this helps the judge understand what happened, what was the dispute about. There was this 10 years back somewhere in US. How did the dispute come to where it is? Then third question is, what do you want the court to do? Very important for you to articulate it, that this is the legal question that I want you to answer, or this is the relief I'm asking from you. And finally, why should the court do it? Fourth point is very, very important, because these are the reasons as to why the judge should rule in your favor, and very, very important for an advocate to know. So again, a brief formulation on how to, and we also try to prepare all these answers, our case in this format, and then we try to do it as an elevator pitch. And I'm on the ground floor, and we are going to the 9th floor, and you have to brief me in the point that we get to the 9th floor.
Okay.
And this,
That's even more interesting.
This is not, I'm sure some of my guys hate me for this, but this really helps in the sense that anyone who's been in the Supreme Court on a miscellaneous day understands that a judge only has 15 seconds or 20 seconds or 10 seconds, for you to grab his interest and get notice issued on an SLP, or to get the judge's attention and tell him this is a case where you should intervene and not dismiss my SLP. So we try to prepare our cases in elevator pitch, that we don't have a lot of time. These 10 seconds is all you get. Tell me. That gives the ability to the younger associate to isolate the important issues from the secondary issues and only talk about the most important. As they say, sell the sizzle first, the steak can wait. The bigger ideas, the other details, all of that can wait. You just tell me the first idea, the most important idea first. So yeah, these are some of the things that we use in the chamber to make better briefing, or to brief seniors better. I told you about the rule of cram, who did what to whom, and these folks.
How did it happen? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But stick to the golden rule when you're writing judgments and other things. If you can't say it, don't write it.
Exactly. That's interesting, Bharat. So Bharat, I have one more question, that we have colonial laws due to which at times lower bench judge face moral dilemma, and trial courts have. Do you think that the trial courts have the power to subside those colonial laws and follow the moral principles? And in such cases where they decide, has it ever been appreciated by the higher bench?
So that's a good question, because some of these dilemmas are faced by the young judges all the time. I have had the opportunity of facing one myself. Broadly, just to start off the discussion, I think it's important to remember that a judge does justice, but he does justice in accordance with law. He doesn't do justice on what his idea of justice is. He cannot be, a knight errant, or he cannot be somebody who's pursuing his own ideal of justice, because his justice may be somebody else's injustice, right? One person's, freedom fighter is another's terrorist. So there are different ways of looking at any given situation on what the justice is. Law is there for a reason. Law is there to tell you that this is justice according to law. This ensures that everyone is not the law unto himself or herself, and there is a general rule of law that is principled judicial decision making and not a very individual decision making. Because otherwise, the citizen's fate would hang on what the judge's personality is. For example, we used to have this big debate on your chances of getting death penalty are completely dependent on if the judge believes in death penalty or not. If he's an abolitionist, then you would not get death penalty. If he's somebody who believes in death penalty, then you might get it. That's extremely uncertain. It should be based on principles rather than the personality of the men before whom you have the fortune or the misfortune to appear before. So coming back, this justice is according to law. Now, if that law itself is not something that yields to justice, for example, if that's a law which is colonial and may not be constitutional anymore. But
Right.
no, none of the courts have ruled on it. If, for
Exactly.
example, as a young judge, as a magistrate or a civil judge, you don't decide constitutionality. It's for the constitutional
Absolutely.
courts to do it. So what do you do in such cases? So one of the ways to approaching this is to formulate a question that yes, there is a law which I feel is unconstitutional, being violative of so and so articles or against the spirit of and letter of so and so judgment, and then formulate that question on why do you think it is unconstitutional and make a reference to the higher courts.
Higher
So
bench.
CPC and
Okay.
CRPC allows you to make such references.
Okay.
Now there is a huge, perception that these references are sometimes not appreciated by the higher courts, and
Yeah.
there is a perception that sometimes it may lead to the impression that possibly the young judge thinks too much of himself, or the young judge is trying to pronounce and evolve law, and it is no business of a young trial judge to evolve law. You have to apply law, on the basis of facts at hand, and you're not even a court of law, you are a court of fact. I don't believe in any of that, to be frank. I think if there is a genuine question that has come up which gives justifiable doubts as to constitutionality, you should frame those questions, refer it to the higher court. The law allows you to do it. This is one way of approaching it. Another way of approaching it is that you try to find out a way within the existing law by trying to creatively interpret laws. For example, a situation may be 125 of the CRPC, to take a very simple example, provides for maintenance of the wife and children of a person, right? If you've been
Yeah.
neglected, you can go in for maintenance. The
Yeah.
question is somebody who's not really a wife, but who's living as a wife for a number of years, is that woman entitled to maintenance or not? Now,
Right.
a very literal reading of the law would show it has to be wife. So just because a woman is living with somebody without doing the Saat Feras and other rites and
Safiras. Right.
ceremonies, that woman should not get maintenance,
Right.
because I'm literal and I'm somebody who cannot evolve the law. So in those cases, the dilemma comes, whether you can creatively interpret the word to say that yes, I understand the legislative intent. The intent was to provide relief to women from starvation and destitution. And if a woman who's lived as a wife for all these years and who's I mean, for example, they've got
All
kids together,
responsibilities. Right.
yeah, and
Right.
they go attend the PT meeting together, for example. And just because Saat Feras are not done, this does not mean it is not wife. So the word wife is used in a liberal sense and not in a literal strict sense.
Yeah.
It should be a
Yeah.
de facto wife and not a de jure wife, as you call it.
So they have defined in the act term wife also.
Yeah. So how do you, for example, if you feel that the definition is also unconstitutional, let's take it a point further. Then one way is to frame that question. For example, in this case, fortunately, the Supreme Court's already ruled on it, where they say that we have to look at it in the broader sense. Otherwise, the law itself would become unconstitutional, because then it would draw a very, very arbitrary classification between women who've just been living for a number of years and women who've done Saat Feras. And they say even a woman who's been living as a wife for a very long period of time in a relationship that is all marriage-like, then she's also entitled. But if you don't have that sort of guidance, another example, which is something that I had the opportunity of ruling, and it's out there, and I've written about this, where a provision in the Railways Act provided for that if anyone is selling anything in a train or is begging or selling anything without a license or without permission from the railway authorities is punishable,
Yeah.
and you can't do it. And I when I started off as a judge, this is one of the first assignments. I saw that they used to prosecute a lot of young people for selling tea, for selling snacks in a train, or water bottles and other things. And all of these guys would be standing before me as accused. The police has got them as if they've done some heinous offense, and they are
My God.
threats to national security. And it would really pain me to see them that these are the guys
Yeah.
who are actually eking out a living and trying
Yeah.
to do good. And obviously, the state is not providing them any placements as an
At
opportunity.
least they are not begging. But
They are not begging or they are not turning to crime. They are actually
yeah.
fulfilling a need. Somebody
Yeah.
needs tea in a train, and they're fulfilling that need by providing honest tea and with honesty. And they are doing they are actually engaging in productive exercise. More
Yeah.
than anything else, this is not a conscious choice that they made. Who
Right.
starts off from his village wanting to go and sell tea? No, they never start off with that dream. The dream is to take up a job and send money back home and bring the entire family out of poverty, and to call them all to the city now when they migrated. That's the idea. So when you cannot provide for these guys, you cannot create enough employment, you have no moral right to be punishing them. That was my instinctive response to it, and it pained me terribly. Now the idea was, how do you find out a way? You are not the law unto yourself. You cannot say this is what I feel and I'll do it, right? You're bound
Yeah,
by the law.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
there you try to look for ways and means and how you can create a remedy. So I had read those cases about those cases that we discussed in law school. If 5 people are stranded on a boat and they kill one, and if they eat that person, can they still be prosecuted for murder or not? Or can they say, no, this was a defense of necessity, and necessity knows no law. We had to do it in order to stay alive ourselves. Can they take that defense or not? Is what my thought process. That's how I started. I said, can this guy take a defense that I'm doing this because of necessity, because I do not have any other option. I need to keep myself alive, and this is the only honorable option that I had. And I got really inspired by some of the foreign decisions which said that in a given situation, stealing bread is not a crime. If there are circumstances to justify, which is dying of starvation. Of course, it does not legitimize stealing. Otherwise, we would have anarchy. If this is stealing is not an
Yeah.
offense. But in a
Right.
given case, if you're convinced. So I was inspired by that. I was inspired by another Delhi High Court judgment on decriminalization of begging, where the court went in with a went on with a similar logic, where they say this is we need to get rid of poverty. We do not need to get rid of the poor, right? The concept
Absolutely.
should end. It's not that nobody should beg. The answer is nobody should have to beg. And in this
Absolutely.
case, if you are not able to ensure that, there is no moral right. So I invoke the doctrine of necessity to cut the long story short in a number of cases, and said these guys have not made conscious choices. I understand that the law does not require any mens rea, guilty intent and all of that. It's a strict liability offense. If you are selling it without license, that's the end of the matter. I understand all of that, but in this case, the necessity is clear. Indian Penal Code provides a defense of necessity. I'm invoking it, and all these guys are out. So I used to pass a lot of orders, exonerating these people, and those orders were appreciated. And
Did you have any kind of fear at that moment of time that I might higher bench do? It is a possibility that benches do not appreciate
so that's
these.
that's always a concern. Is it something that's out,
A
because
fear.
whenever you're doing something new, you would always think what would be the implications. I would never use the word fear, because I've never been afraid. I had a very very a good legal practice before I came into the system, and to be very very frank, I did my job as a judge to the best of my ability and with integrity, as if
No
every
doubt
day was
about
my
it.
last day at job. I was never afraid of doing the right thing because of reprisals. I would not do anything just because it's politically correct to do. I would do
Okay.
it as I told you. It's a very Sarfarosh sort of a thing, and you experience it that
Yeah.
I'm actually releasing thousands and thousands of people and doing real justice. But there is a concern that it is a new step. Nobody's done it. Nobody has examined so far the legality of it. It is your own understanding and your reading. But if you have confidence in your level of scholarship and your understanding of law, you should go ahead and do it. The appellate courts are there for a reason. If you're wrong, then correct it. Yeah. If you exonerate these people and they think they are still guilty, these people can be taken into custody again. So there's no problem. But don't, stifle yourself, because many of these things have to be started at the ground level itself. And because you see people on a daily basis, most people interact with a trial magistrate and no other judge in their system. And you have to understand their plight, and you have to do the right thing. And then I'm not a religious or a spiritual sort of a guy, but at the end of the day, you have to do your dharma or karma or whatever, and leave rest to whatever the consequences are. And I'm damn sure if you're good with your law, and if you've striked the boxes, and if you've done your homework, it is appreciated. In this case, it was appreciated, and I was humbled to see the kind of response that it elicited. I was commended for this order, and
Wow.
some of the finest judges that we've had went on to say that it helped them shape their orders in a lot of ways, and this was the best thing that I could have heard. I've always looked up to them as a young judge. I wanted to be like them, and looking at them,
Kind of an achievement when you hear such words of something you did, and
yeah.
yeah.
So that really gives you an impetus to try and do the right thing again and again, and not be too technical or literal, and forget that law is a means to an end, and the end is justice. Law does not exist for its own sake, right?
Yeah,
Procedure is not something that exists for its own sake. The
absolutely.
tail, as I like to say, should not start wagging the dog. The tail is there for a reason. It's a procedure. It's the justice that we are concerned with. So, yeah.
Very well said.
I
Very well
don't
said.
think anyone could have put it in more better words. And sir,
Absolutely.
you are already an ideal for all of us.
Yeah, you're kind.
Moving ahead
Yeah.
to the next question.
Mhm.
So, how important is legal research and how can one aid the art of researching?
Right. Very, very important. I mean, and this comes to the basic point I was making, that the entire profession is based on knowledge asymmetry. There is somebody who's a client who's coming to you because you know something that he doesn't. You win a case by knowing something that your opposite side doesn't. You win a case by convincing the judge by knowing something that the judge did not know, and you help the judge see it that way. So it is all based on what you know. And when it is all based on what you know, research is extremely important. And, and it is not just important in the sense of, how we do research conventionally. You need to take it a step beyond. I see, these days with, and this makes me sound like older than I am when I say these days. But, for example, now, someone would start the research with Google, for example, or start the research with SEC Online or any other, portal or any other software. I would say that that's something that's the next step. That's step two. First you need to go back to the Bare Act. You need to look at the language of reception. You need to read the illustrations. You need to then possibly look at the standard commentaries on the subject, and then you see what's the legislative history, how the law has evolved, parliamentary debates, constituent assembly debates, and other primary materials to help you understand the law. And then when you are looking at precedent, you come to your credible sources and your journals, CSCC, and others to look at precedent, to look at words and phrases, to look at foreign precedent, to look at other global best practices. So that's the order that it should follow. Never start with Google as the first point of research, and research in
Right.
an organized way where you build up a case as you go along, and go for credible sources, where things are reported the way that they are, and uh, uh, you know it should be primary sources more than hearsay or what somebody's personal opinion is. So that's important.
Moving ahead to the next question, sir. You have been decorated several number of times. Congratulations for the INBA 2018 Young Lawyer of the Year award. So my question to you is, where do you see yourself in the next 10 years, or what is your next 10-year agenda?
Wow, this really makes me think. Actually, uh, you know, I I I know it in terms of what broadly I'm going to do, if not the specifics. So the idea is this. Number one, I feel guilty sometimes about having left the system, and I make no secrets about it. Not guilty because I sort of have any regrets, but guilty in the sense that I do not continue to give back the way that I possibly used to do, or the way in which I used to do. I used to do a lot of justice on an everyday basis, right? Right now, I'm in a private commercial law practice. Yes, I do help in decision making. I do take up pro bono cases, but I used to feel that I'm not giving back enough. Although I'm giving back. So what I tried doing was I tried to train a lot of judges, young judges at the academies, judges who want to become judges and are preparing for it. So I'm extremely passionate about training, people to become not just judges, but judges who are not just judging but justicing, who take it a step beyond, and who are armed with the right values and the education and the skills to become extraordinary judges. So I like working with them, engaging with them, answering emails, talking to them on the phone, looking at answers between meetings, doing it when I come back home from work, addressing their questions, and trying to help them read a particular provision, as much as I can do. Of course, I want to do more, but time
Yeah.
doesn't permit me. So the idea is in the next few years to stay on that course, live vicariously, and there is a personal interest there too, because I get to live vicariously through my students who become judges, and I get to do both at the same time. I get to be a lawyer, which was the passion, and then I also get to be a judge when they pass judgments. It's almost like I'm doing it. So that's something I want to work more on in the next few months and years. Working on a book on the how of being a judge and the why of being a judge and what is a judge's life. The idea is to put a young student in the driving seat as a judge, and just share everything that I can, which would not only help young lawyers make the decision on whether they want to be judges or not, but also help them along the way and help them write better. And when they become judges, serve as a desk book for them, so that it guides them on different areas of common problems where young judges face. So yeah, that's something I'm working on. I'm obviously keen to work on my cases. I'm very keen on my legal practice. I have the great fortune of being able to do, something as diverse as white collar crime, international arbitration, and technology as practice areas. I get to do all. So uh, great fun. I look forward to that. I look forward to trial work. This is one of my favorite areas of legal practice: cross examination, arguments, and I personally believe that that's where the foundation of everything is, and that I also believe that this is a great vacuum in terms of our legal sector. We have great appellate advocacy, but we do not have as many great trial lawyers as that. And for the listeners also, it's important that you address that vacuum by focusing. There's a huge need, for great trial lawyers. So you fill that vacuum, and I intend, on continuing to do that. So that's there. Also, wanting to give back more in terms of good pro bono causes is something I'm looking at. So yeah,
Okay.
these three things, and continuing to do them is the action plan. Yeah.
Bharat, are you presently working on any book?
So yeah, I'm as I said that on the life of a young judge, and
Okay.
so it is meant to serve as a guide on how to do it. It is also meant to serve as a series of my experiences. It is too early in life to be writing a memoir. I would not be so immodest to say that I'm writing that, but it does share my experiences and many more cases that I had the opportunity of doing, and that would help a young judge, deal with those challenges themselves. What happens? How do you start your day? How do you deal with your court staff? How do you deal with the members of the bar? How do you deal if your judgment gets overruled? Different aspects which nobody's talked about as yet, which is
Absolutely.
natural because not many people, on the trial side have written about these experiences, and that is
True.
understandable because as long as you are in service, you cannot write publicly on a lot of issues because there
Yes,
are
sir.
issues of restraint, and so there is a limitation there. But since I'm not there anymore, I can choose to, and I think this would be a good learning curve for everyone, including me.
We are looking
So,
forward to this book now.
exactly.
Bharat, just one thing that who is your inspiration? Who kept you moving forward?
Well, it's I'm not, taking time to answer this because there are none. I'm taking time to answer this because there are many people. So, as they say, you learn from everyone and everything. You if you've failed a number of times, you've learned from yourself. I've looked up to a lot of judges. Justice Krishna Iyer, Justice Chinnappa Reddy used to be great role models as far as judging was concerned. Justice Bhagwati, Justice Kuldeep Singh, uh, uh, and Privy Council judges, Lord Denning, Lord Atkin, were great role models as judges because I could see that they are so intelligent, they are well read, they do great justice, and they do it, in a way that improves the lives of people on the ground level. So they were great inspirations. On the practice side of it, yes, there are again inspirational figures like this Nariman. Uh,
Yeah.
Elsewhere, there is Clarence Darrow. Many inspirational lawyers who Dr. Ambedkar, who've really shaped the world as we see it. So I've read about them, and I've tried to emulate some of what they have done in their lives. I don't like hero worship, to be be very, very clear.
Okay.
I think you should test your heroes and even more, and
Yeah.
not accept anything uncritically. But
Right.
yes, looking up to a few people and emulating and learning from the best and standing on the shoulders of giants is very, very important. And you know, as you read, you get to have inspirations in not just law, in other fields. For example, Steve Jobs is a brilliant person to look at if you're looking for inspiration.
Right.
His
Absolutely.
sheer doggedness to create the perfect product that combines art with technology is brilliant, right?
And how he started his struggle.
His struggle, I mean,
And then
the
he was
way.
removed from his very own company.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's
Yes.
so much to learn. I mean, and I learned from it that sometimes you should let perfect be the enemy of the good. You have to create the perfect product. You have to create. He used to say that please also, do the nuts and bolts also really well, things that people don't see because he had the knack of perfection. And I think that's how you should look at all your drafts and all your arguments. You are as good as your last draft. You are as good as your last performance. And you get so many. So for the younger lawyers, you can't really advertise in India. But if you're doing a case in the court and you put your heart and soul and you've done it really well, you'll get so many clients from the court. The court would appoint you as the amicus. There are litigants who are watching. They would come and ask you for your cards. It has happened so many times. There was a time when I got 6 clients from one court just because I argued a matter and walked out, and there were other people who said, "Why don't you do our case also?" And I ran out of my visiting cards. And
Wow.
I didn't have a godfather, I didn't have a lot of referrals
That
or
might
anything,
have
but
felt
that's
so
how I
amazing.
built my practice. And so take every performance to be that you have to achieve perfection. There is not even a single case law that you should not know of, either for or against. And that's how you should work. If you have to make a dent into the world, you have to be really good at what you do and passionate. And if you're passionate, it wouldn't feel like work. Even if you're doing 18 hours, then it feels like that you're doing something that makes you really happy. And every day is a holiday then, and not really a working day. You're working on the treadmill in the gym. You are reading up on the latest judgment or something, that's something new that has come up, and you're doing it while you're doing other things, and it doesn't feel like work. You really start enjoying it. It becomes a part of your life.
Yeah. So here, Bharat, we come to an end, but just want to know one more thing that on a lighter note, we are acquainted with your love for poetry, and it would be really nice if you could share with us the one which is closest to your heart.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sort of expecting this. I like to call myself a closet poet, but
Oh, okay.
I because number one, I don't think it's good enough. Second is, yeah, I mean,
Sir, on
I
the other
seriously think that
I
it's
hand,
not good
we
enough.
would like
disagree
to
with
hear
you.
more of your poetry. There
Yes,
is a lot of
we.
void in the system where you can share your poetry. I think you should.
You are absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
You're too kind. I don't know. I mean, my poem on the railway case that I decided, I think it's already out there.
Yes,
Not
And
sir.
something which is out yet. We need
yeah,
to know
yeah. So
something.
I would talk about something else that I wrote. This was on the question of Juvenile Justice Act. Uh,
Okay.
I strongly felt on issues relating to juvenile justice also back in the day. I felt that we aren't doing enough for some of the children in conflict with law, and we've sort of forgotten them. Sometimes we are not looking adequately into the circumstances they come from, and when we look for their punishment and we look for them to be brought to the book. So I and various amendments were introduced in the Juvenile Justice Act a couple
Mhm.
of years back, where we said that even children who are 16 to 18
Yeah.
have to be treated like adults in certain cases. So
Right.
I slightly opposed that amendment, and I continue to hold that belief. But without getting into, the correctness of the amendment or the validity,
Mhm.
these were some of the thoughts that I had, in when I was approaching that issue, and I ended up writing a few lines. I think I should share that. This may be of some interest. Uh, just give me a second. I would just read a few lines,
Yeah,
not more
definitely.
than that. So this. Look at it from the standpoint of a young kid who's caught, in the legal system. So this is how it goes. Nobody taught me to speak, therefore I can't mince words. I also have to tell rather quickly my tale, for time doesn't stop and the guillotine doesn't fail. I can hear the shouts of the crowd, people who've gathered about. The civilized society is baying for my blood, my young scarlet blood. Upper middle class children would be made to drink from it. I'm told it lulls the demons inside. That's what the priests say. It kills juvenility. Really, that's what they say. But let me not get ahead of myself and begin where it all began. The setting is a one-room house in North Delhi, where I was conceived in Dickensian poverty. I was at peace with not living. I was free before a young couple decided to have me. People called them my mother and father. None, of course, took my consent, and thus I began the journey of life, unwilling, reluctant, and angry. No wonder I caused my mother much pain. First, because of my desire not to be born, and second, there was never any food inside of her. I kicked and gnawed at her insides. She wailed in vain, just for her not to have me, but she didn't budge. I caused her to nearly die while she gave birth to me. You see, that was an act of protest against introduction into this world, this inhospitable sphere of exploitation and injustice. I was raised on my impoverished mother's thin milk, the toxic gruel of poverty, exploitation, and disease. For my parents, my introduction into this world was an act of triumph of unmitigated hope, or the thoughtlessness to their actions. This lack of control of impulse would become the defining feature of my life. Legal battles, television debates would be fought and lost over it, and it would have a bearing on the course my life would take and the choices I would make, and so on and so forth. The rest of the poem, and I'm sure you can print it
It's
out
not
there or put it out
just
there.
about reading but it is coming from you
So
and
it
the
goes on
words.
to talk about his the problems that this guy faces, and suddenly he becomes an offender. A system that did not come and take care of that child when he was in conflict with law now says, okay, let's hang this kid and do this. I personally find this to be extremely insensitive. I firmly believe that even neuroscience says that a person's brain and faculties fully get developed when the person is mid 20s, and so you should treat children differently. I'm not commenting on one case or the other. I need to make clear, but I want to say that treat them with more compassion, treat them with more of a scientific outlook. I mean, we've all done things in college that we are not proud of, right? I mean, I would hate to
Right.
go into those, but just because we come from a certain privilege, we come from a
Yes.
certain background, we were able to protect ourselves. If we were just there like kids on the street working at a dhaba, and then we got into a lot of problems in the world because there was nobody to look out for us, and then the legal system wanted to punish us heinously, I would have a lot of moral and legal problems with the system that thinks like that. So that's what the rest of the poem is about, and please put it out there for everyone to read. I don't want to take any more time with that.
Said the poetry was so deep, and I definitely think that it questions how accomplished we are as in welfare state. Also, this was indeed an enriching session. Thank you for sparing your valuable time for us. And so you have always been an inspiration, and I firmly believe that you will continue to be the same.
Thank you so much. It was lovely being here. Thanks for having me.